All right. Let's see. A couple of things. I don't want us to meet as a class on Tuesday. Okay, it's election day. A lot of you have a lot of things on your mind. I'm going to be expected to run herd on this thing. It's just, I'm just saying, it's going to be make my life easier. Give me Tuesday to focus on the election because I already agreed to be part of a panel, and that means I got to track the early results and a lot of other things. But I think just from talking to some of you individually, and I've just come out of several meetings about the election and things that we might do on campus with respect to the election and its meaning and its results and all that, I guess it seems to me there's a certain amount of, I don't know if I'd say anxiety, certainly uncertainty. It might be, it might just be distracting for us to try and think about colonialism and all this kind of stuff. And I just think it might be better if we just take that day. But what I want from you, because a number of you on this, and I'm not worried about this, I was fairly general about how I described your proposal, but some of you by way of proposal just sent me an email and said, I'm going to do this one. And you didn't tell me what there was about that case that was interesting. You didn't tell me who the colonizer, you didn't give me any information. You just said, well, I want to do this. Okay. That was okay then. It's not okay now. Most of what we're going to be doing, especially after today, and for the remaining roughly 4 weeks of the class, not counting week 11 and also losing the week of Thanksgiving, right? So we really only have about 2 productive weeks of class left, the way the calendar is shaking out, right? Is that we are going to be talking about particular cases, okay? I'm going to be hearing from you about the work you're doing on your own cases, and then we might take some of the concepts that we've looked at and then try and figure out if there's a case that we can recognize and think, okay, let's walk through this. Because from here on in, if you've applied yourselves to the reading and you paid any attention at all to the discussions in class other than just sort of clicking admit and staying there, right? You should have enough to be going on with conceptually to be able to take particularly a fairly orthodox case of colonialism and make sense of it, okay? So the idea now is let's apply what we're learning, which will reinforce what we're learning and will stress our capacity to understand it in some way that will encourage us to understand it more thoroughly than we do, okay? So that's pretty much what we're going to do. Yes, please do sign in. That's what we're going to be doing for the next few weeks. So again, no class on Tuesday. Do the election, get it out of your system. But by Thursday, I want you to have emailed me, not as an email, but as a separate document, an updating of whatever your proposal is. And I want some meat on the bone. I want to know more about who the colonizer was, who was in the resistance, was it an ethnic resistance? Some of the things we talked about, what was the nature of that resistance? We're going to talk more about that today by way of more or less finishing up with that most crucial part of Kennedy's analysis for purposes of what we're doing, which is, we're going to be looking at chapter 3 today, and that'll take us up to the nation state, chapter 4, which I'm less interested in at this point. Because remember, you're not talking about post-colonialism. We're just looking at the process of decolonization. If that leads you naturally into a discussion of subsequent actions or phenomena derived from the decolonizing process that created post-colonial problems, then I'll discuss that with you individually, okay? But the emphasis from here on in is going to be on your cases, because this is going to be, the case study is going to weigh very heavily in terms of my assessment of your final course grade. It doesn't mean your midterm didn't matter. What it means is that, the real demonstration of what you've learned in this class is going to be your ability to apply it to a specific case, okay? And I'm giving you plenty of time to do those. There are no other distractions, no new readings. You can use any of the readings we've got here. I would remind you too, that every one of the readings that's assigned, if you want it, I can send you the bibliography for it, or anything else. And on the Kennedy book itself, you all presumably have a physical copy of that. That's got references in it. There are other places to look. Hannon Library is your friend. If you're hitting a wall on that, Dottie Orms is more than happy to work with all of the history and political science students. Just shoot her an email, let her know what you're working on, maybe set up a Zoom meeting, whatever you want to do. She's always happy to work with students, okay? And she is a resource. She knows that archive very well. So, you know, she is also your friend. All right, so first of all, are there any questions? No class on Tuesday. You may indeed still be hungover from Halloween. That would be excellent. It'd be nice to think that somebody went out and had a good Halloween. I don't know how you're going to do that in COVID, but yeah, I guess cautiously but decoratively. But in the meantime, since we're not meeting in class, right? I want you to some of you, it will essentially be your first draft because all you said is, I'm going to do this country. I want more detail and I want it in a document. Okay, I'm going to create a file and I'm going to start tracking everybody's work, just as I would if I were your supervisor and I had deployed you to. I need you to do an in-depth analysis of the process of decolonization of this particular country because we're contemplating a certain policy with respect to aid or military intervention or whatever it is. Let me know what I need to know to understand this country by understanding the process through which it ceased to be a colony, okay? Think of it that way. I don't know what that means. Are we able to upload our notes for this set of models readings? Upload our notes. Oh, you mean separately? No. No, there's no need to do that. There's no need to do that. It was largely for me to be able to track to make sure that it's a fair question. Sorry for not initially understanding that. I have been babbling on Zoom since 7:30 this morning. I'm spent. Okay, so I'm going to apologize in advance for sounding like an inarticulate idiot. It's 1:40 and I'm still drinking coffee because I have to. But no, you don't need to do that. It allowed me to see what you were deriving from or extracting from the literature in preparation for the midterm. Since we don't really have a final, but instead you have this case study assignment, that's not as crucial now, okay? When I evaluate your grade though, of course, I've got copies now of up to the end at the midterm of everything that you had in your notes. I created separate files. That'll help me evaluate your midterm in the context of how much work you put into it, and everything else, because there's the midterm grade you've been given. It is conceivable that when I finalize your grade, if I go back and find that you really did an extraordinary amount of work, by the way, there's no point in adding to those things now because I already know what was there before. So don't waste your time. Concentrate on your case study. I may weigh that midterm a little more heavily in the final analysis because I can see that it is as a consequence of some pretty assiduous note-taking and things like that. Most of your grades won't, none of them will go down, all right, on the midterm. In the terms of the grading structure of the class, the final assignment is going to weigh more heavily than the midterm. Midterm was important, but this final case study is really that's what's going to demonstrate to me that you've gotten something out of the class, other than just being able to spit back things that we've already talked about. All right, so any questions? No class on Tuesday. By the time we meet on Thursday, you've sent to me a document in some format other than pages, please, no pages. Send me something that I can read that will let me know, okay, I'm going to start a file on you now, and it's going to start with this document, okay? Oh, there's the little guy. You can't do that, man. I'm a sucker for little kids. It's just like, hey, look, a little one, a little drunken adult. Yeah, I like it. All right, so any questions? All right. Oh, man. I've been spending all day talking about the election. I haven't even had a chance to talk about, colonialism. It's awful. All of a sudden, out of the woodwork, right? I'm here 25 years, almost nobody ever asked me anything. Now, all of a sudden, I'm getting all these frantic emails and, Zoom requests for Zoom meetings. Hey, Bill, can we talk about the election? I'm like, why didn't you ask me 20 years ago? God damn it. All right. For chapter 3, there is a theme to chapter 3 that I think is worthwhile in terms of positioning you to begin the inquiry into your case study. And it's this question of the degree to which the decolonization project involved more conciliation or coercion. Okay, clearly that's the theme that Kennedy's established. What does he mean by that, and how does he set that argument up? What is he talking about there? Conciliation and coercion.
Oh, go ahead. Okay, so the conciliation, meaning that the way that at least I understood it was that kind of tried to come at the decolonization project or recolonizing after World War I and maintaining those colonies in an effort where you're working with these groups of people and trying not to come at it.
Working with them to accomplish what, though?
To accomplish like a sense of stability.
And what were some of the ways that, right, okay, so the challenge is, all of this is about recovery from the trauma of the Second World War and the dislocations of the Second World War and the shattering of the economies of the Second World War, right? The conciliation part of that, Pamela, then would be what? We're being conciliatory with probably indigenous elites. What are we trying to accomplish?
I would say a sense of a maintained relationship, whether that be like an economic relationship or still some kind of control in that area.
Why? First of all, why? I mean, you know, why are we still fooling around with colonies and empire when every major European power practically has its back broken by the war?
So some of the examples that they use were like the British, for example, kind of putting money into recovery programs for the colonies because the colonies were still, or at least some of them were still bringing in like resources that were critical for the crumbling economies of like the metropolis.
Okay, all right. No, that's good. That's good. In other words, they were part of the care and feeding of the metropolis, of the metropole. It was like, we still need you. Okay, so part of it was there was a purely economic imperative. You know, we still need the resources that we're extracting from your colony. We understand that as a consequence of the experience of the war, the relationship has been altered. But rather than abolish it, let's stabilize that altered relationship in some pattern of continuity. Now, the two interesting cases here are the French and the British. How do they go about, and there are different ways to do this, but think about, and not just Pamela, think about the examples that Kennedy offers you and think, well, what were some of the ways that what did France do? What did Britain do specifically in order to try to maintain some of its empire while conceding simultaneously, we are not the power we once were, and we're having, in fact, in Britain's case, we're having trouble feeding our own people. What did they do?
Like in the case of France with Laos and Cambodia surrounding Vietnam, they didn't want to potentially have that threat spill back over into those countries and have to fight a three-pronged war. So they gave up control in Laos and Cambodia to kind of attempt to solidify their stance in that region so that they weren't fighting communism on multiple fronts. It was just kind of contained to the Viet Minh instead of
okay, so you're arguing that by decolonizing Laos in particular, that by decolonizing Laos, they're exercising a kind of anti-communist containment. Is that right?
Yeah, trying to win favor in Laos by giving them the country instead of, you know, maintaining an oppositional stance so that they didn't change sides and want to ally with.
Why would they be concerned about that?
Other than the general Cold War fearing of communism.
No, I'm not being
It's
facetious. That's one of the reasons. If this is in the context of the Cold War, that's why one of the little blurbs I put here was this idea, what did I say, riding the Cold War wave? I mean, that's what we're talking about. Part of France's policy was mitigated by concerns about the spread of communism.
and they were also just coming off World War II, which in another context, it's important to see how easily Germany was sweeping through Europe, and then all of a sudden they decided to fight a two-front war, and it broke them. So that's a very contemporary lesson also.
Okay, that's important because it's one of the things that's been left out of our discussions more than I'm comfortable with is, yes, there's always an economic motive here, and we don't want to underplay that. But what I'm suggesting is a lot of the motivation for trying either in a limited way to decolonize, say with something like Laos, which, the idea there is we're giving you independence, but we're cutting that deal with royalists, with a traditional conservative, organically anti-communist leadership stratum, which, by the way, was tremendously popular in the countryside. Okay, why are we doing that? For geostrategic stability. Okay, because we need to contain and ultimately crush this insurgency in Vietnam. Remember, this is before and leading up to and in the immediate aftermath of Dien Bien Phu. Okay, and the absolute disgrace of that for France. Okay, so yeah, it's this idea we're playing a long geopolitical game here. The world is a different place after the Second World War. We can still project force for purposes of stability, even if ultimately the purpose of that stability is not just to kill communists, but in fact to make sure that we have access to resources and everything else. So please don't undervalue that geostrategic component, especially after the Second World War. And I'll give you another example that is commonly misunderstood, okay? And that would be India. And Kennedy, this is the first, sort of easily accessible source where Kennedy he reminds us, all of that imperial dominance that Britain enjoyed for well over a century, most of that came at the barrel of a gun, but it wasn't always the British military. It was often troops recruited and trained in India. India was the sort of armed camp. The Raj was for the projection of force by the British Empire. Okay, so there were ultimately hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of potential fighting men in India. It was one of the reasons why Britain fought so hard to come to some sort of an alliance, or the things that Pamela was talking about. Let's be, we'll make some concessions to you because we need, in fact, to keep this relationship. Even you might be a semi-sovereign India, but we'll have this sort of alliance. And they kept waffling on it, and they kept putting it off until, of course, finally, these insurgent movements within India lost their patience and it became violent. And I mean, for all this talk about, Mahatma Gandhi and all that kind of stuff, it was violent. Okay, it wasn't about passive resistance. Passive resistance was not going to lead to Indian independence. That's nonsense. Okay, it was the idea that India was an armed camp. Okay, that's much more, geostrategic than it is economic. Okay, so that is, Brett's right. We can't forget those examples. Yeah, we have to have some conciliation here because we still need that firepower, right? Because the British, remember, after the Second World War, the British were sending people still all over the world to try to contain these anti-colonial brush fires. They created the National Service, their first peacetime conscription, right? But they weren't just keeping those people as a home guard. They were sending them, many of them, out into the colonial world. Kennedy talks about this. They still were trying to fill that role of global policemen, okay? In order to do that, they needed recruits. They needed bodies. A lot of those bodies for Britain were coming out of India. Because what were the hot spots? Think of the breaking up of the British Empire, particularly in Asia. What were the real volatile hot spots, according to Kennedy? Some that really exploded. What's that?
Kenya and Malaysia?
Okay, well, initially Malaysia. And also, if you think about Burma and what it had gone through in the Second World War, and this notion of a kind of Burmese rage against any kind of external domination. You think of a greater Malaysia, the attempt to create an alliance there. It was because, first of all, this gets back to Brett's point, there was a small but absolutely committed communist insurgency that had to be crushed and was violently crushed, right? And it took a surprisingly long time to do it. Where else? Kenya, when did Kenya become important? And when did it become a hot spot? Because initially after the war, it was not. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, Kenya was not on fire.
Wasn't it the early 60s with Mau Mau?
That would be the mid 50s.
Oh, okay.
Beginning of the mid to late 50s. Yeah. What was that all about? What was Mau Mau all about? In other words, where was it an example for was it an example of where conciliation failed and so coercion became necessary? See, I'm trying to get you to think in the context of the framework that Kennedy's established here, because certainly when you think of the British and you think of Mau Mau, you do not think of conciliation.
Didn't the British initially like try to give like slightly more concessions to some of the rulers in Kenya, and then it was like almost totally ignored? And
well, remember that it wasn't just in Kenya. What were they trying to do in East Africa? This gets back to what Pamela was talking about with conciliation. Kennedy helps. Sorry, I stepped on somebody there.
Oh, that was me. They were creating those large blocks of countries.
Right. Yes.
oh yeah, the federations or the whatever they're called.
Yeah, that was the first attempt at what I think, Pamela, you would describe as conciliation. Is that right? Okay, why did it fail? Kennedy suggests that it failed, that it never even really got off the drawing board. Why not? I can give you a hint. It wasn't communism.
No, it was local politics, for lack of a thorough term. Racial divisions, cultural divisions, just like we talked about earlier in the term of South America with the countries down there. It's just too much butting of heads of the people who were supposed to be making up the federations. They were fighting each other, civil war, genocide within those.
Well, and also a bigger part of World War II, if you're on this national stage, basically proclaiming like liberty and autonomy for your own countries and your own peoples, like that, I feel like was a big part of that as well too. If you were in these federations that were like semi-autonomous, kind of having their own local populations governing things, why wouldn't they also want their own autonomy?
Because they
democracy.
So, sorry, say that again, because I stepped.
Oh, and saying like democracy, like the flip side of communism is democracy.
Well, I wouldn't quite say that, because I would say that first of all, in Southeast Asia, for example, their version of democracy was communism. As weird as that sounds to us. In other words, Ho Chi Minh really believed, if you look at the first architecture that he proposed for a unified Vietnam, it was a republic. It was a constitutional republic. And it may have been at its core radical by comparison to the United States, but it wasn't going to be a one-party monolith, dictatorial meat grinder of humanity kind of thing. All right. But your point's important. As Brett suggests, we made the mistake of thinking about Africa in the same way that we think about communism, that it was monolithic, that there was an Africa, and we had possessions in that Africa, and those Africans could be governed because they couldn't govern themselves. All those cliches and stereotypes really did inform British imperial policy. Remember that a lot of the contemporary leadership of that time had no idea what was really going on in sub-Saharan Africa. So the assumption was, well, we'll just throw them all together into this big territorial alliance, and won't that be jolly? And of course, you talk to the indigenous people and they're like, no, not so much. Because as Brett suggested, it's like, wait a minute, we're not those people. We have a mutually unintelligible language. We have a unique history and culture. We're not those people. And in fact, we don't want to have to share power with them. We want to determine our own political destiny. And some of you are thinking on some of those cases. Sorry, Kyle, go ahead.
Do you think it would be accurate to say that the British made the same mistake they did in like dividing the Ottoman Empire and a lot of other colonial struggles of like they didn't separate cultural groups properly and they kind of just lumped people in the wrong spots and they're like, this is fine.
I think that is a plausible argument that's worth exploring. And it might, for some of you, it might be an indispensable component of the case study that you've chosen. That, you know, part of the initial refusal to be drawn in by conciliation is because of the myopia of British imperial policy. You might indeed say the same thing about the French. So if we can say that the British policy of conciliation was alliance building what Brett referred to as these blocks, right? What was the French policy? Think about Algeria.
Crush the resistance.
Sorry. I stepped on somebody there.
Oh, that was me. They tried to put everything down violently.
Well, not really. No, not initially. There was an initial policy of conciliation in France. That's why I said think of Algeria.
Was that the French Union policy? Everyone's going to become a part of the metropole and you'll slowly get citizenship
Yes.
and we'll make it all happen, I promise,
Yes.
at some point.
Yeah, and that's important. I mean, you know, we can look at it now and we can feel kind of snide and cynical about it. But there were a lot of people, certainly in the metropole, who thought, yes, this is perfectly appropriate. At some point in the future, you know, these people will really be fully enfranchised French citizens. Okay, that is, you know, we're going to kind of assimilate them into a greater union. They are our overseas territories. You know, they're part of a reconstituted French Republic. Okay, and that's not quite the same as the alliance building and block building that the Brits were doing. Because remember, the Brits, for the most part, were not promising citizenship for people. It was just, you know, somewhere way down in the future, right, you'll join the Commonwealth or something like that. But there were no specific immediate plans for that. The French postured at times as though they were going to do that. One of the cases where they initially offered that, of course, was Algeria. Because remember, there were thousands of regulation size of weight French citizens already living there. Okay, they considered themselves, although living in Algeria, still to be part of the metropole, still to be part of the French Republic. So the idea after the war was, right, this is what AJ was talking about, is yeah, we'll just expand the Republic to include these overseas territories, right? But it didn't work. So what Kennedy is suggesting is that there were initially attempts to somehow to acquire what Pamela referred to as stability, post-war stability. Many of these, not all of them, were initially at least these overtures of conciliation, you know, but they were always tempered by this idea of, look, we now have this shared history and this shared experience, and you know, we can offer you things that you won't have the opportunity to have on, you know, if you go it alone. If you stick with us, you know, we can offer you these it was often framed in terms of partnerships and things like that, and shared burdens and, you know, possibilities for a new future and all that kind of stuff. Now, and I'm talking about the period of time from about 1946, 47, all the way through the early 50s. Okay, by that time, most of this stuff has fallen apart. The early, you know, Malaysian, Greater Malay kind of alliance thing had fallen apart. They put it back together. Singapore, you know, Singapore was very problematic. Okay. So part of it was that. Part of it was just this idea of initial overtures of conciliation, but most of them, according to Kennedy, ringing hollow for the colonized because they weren't really promising that much. And most of what they were promising would accrue overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, to those indigenous elites who'd sort of been the collaborator class in the colonies anyway. And there were just simply too many other young, ambitious, and increasingly politically radical among the colonized who were saying, that's not good enough. There was a new generation that had kind of come of age during the war. Okay. And I would remind you too, leading to the coercion element of this, that in chapter 2, Kennedy leaves us at the end of chapter 2 reminding us the experience of war for the young colonized was the normalization of violence, that this is a necessary condition. That perspective that's articulated by Frantz Fanon, that this, it's going to, baptism in blood, that kind of stuff. Well, if you see that, if that's the way you see the world, it's not going to be easy to cut a deal with you, especially if you're cutting a deal with you that kind of leaves you pretty clearly, on the back foot. And so, how does coercion manifest when conciliation fails? If we can oversimplify, okay, we tried conciliation, it didn't work. What prompts the kind of coercion that sometimes became absolutely brutal violence? What happened? We'd just been through the shattering experience of war. And then, within a couple of years, we're doing, in many cases, what could be described as genocide. One case of which AJ's already pointed out was Mau Mau. What happened? Let me give you a hint, because this is complex. I'm not being condescending. Kennedy talks about the importance of the local police forces. Do you remember that discussion? Okay, good. Because that's really important. It's really especially important in places like Singapore. But the colonial police were essentially a military or paramilitary organization. And that in some of the colonies, when the initial conciliating offers were made and rejected, the police actually operated under law that was changed, restrictions on them, regulations on them that allowed them to engage in extra legal and incredibly brutal tactics in order to put down resistance. Because they had two missions simultaneously. One was to enforce colonial law. I mean, crimes are committed in the colonies as they are anywhere where human beings live. The other one was to put down insurrection. Normally, putting down insurrection isn't your domestic police force, okay? Especially in an overseas territory, that's a military operation. So what was happening was, see if this sounds familiar apropos of the United States, the police became increasingly militarized. And the tactics they used and the weapons they used and the use of torture and the use of, acts of terror in many cases. I give you the French, right? Those things created the conditions of really brutal police states where the colonial administration had been. How did that happen and why did it happen? In other words, this is what Kennedy is trying to explain. What took us into that phase of violence and coercion?
Well, I guess you could say it starts with the failed deals and the relatively radicalized colonized.
Okay, can you think of any cases mentioned in the chapter where, because Kennedy's trying to kind of walk you through it. See, all of a sudden, there's the situation. This you can't deal with these people. We have to crush them. What kind of resistance were we talking about? What are some of the... Mau Mau is one of those cases. Because remember what we're dealing with.
I remember reading.
Go ahead, Jennifer. I'm sorry.
Didn't the British bomb them? Or did I read too far ahead?
Didn't what? I'm not sure what you're asking.
Are you talking about when the Royal Navy, the British? I lost you. There are a number of cases under Britain, cases under France. Yeah, you are, but feel free to use the chat, Jennifer, if you want to, if you frame a question. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the chat up and running. Okay, there we go. All right. What are some of the cases in the chapter that that Kennedy uses as illustrations. I'll see if I can, hold on. All right, one of them, the ones that a lot of you will forget about, will be, what about Indonesia? Indonesia was incredibly problematic and involved, by the way, more than one colonial power. It involved both the Dutch, everyone forgets about the Dutch, right? And the Brits. What was going on in Indonesia? This is discussed pretty extensively in the book. I'm not asking you about anything that's not covered in the book.
Well, I found what was going on in Kenya.
All right,
I
well,
finally found that part.
somebody come back to Indonesia later on. But all right, talk to me about Kenya. That's another case. That's okay, as long as we find some illustration of this.
Okay. Well, the idea is that there basically are a series of lands that are sequestered that are not allowed for native Kenyans. They're only allowed for the colonized.
Where are
like
most of these lands located?
I think it's like, is it like more fertile areas, but I'm trying to think of it.
It's the Kenyan highlands.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of it's the highlands. Why are the highlands so important in Kenya? What's one of their major
I would
exports?
assume
Is it agriculture, like ranching?
Coffee.
Oh, yeah. That would
Coffee
be it.
plantations, massively profitable and all owned by white people, by white settlers. Who is that displacing? The Kikuyu. Mau Mau does not involve a general anti-colonial resistance in Kenya. It is specific to the Kikuyu. Okay. So tell me how, why did that get so violent? What happened? Because it did. It was absolutely brutal on both sides. The British ultimately kind of out-brutaled even Mau Mau.
Well, I think it starts with the rebellion from, or some form of resistance from the Kikuyu, and then the police state of the British basically strikes back with a bunch of extra legal strategies, which obviously, aren't taken that well, because, torture and relocation is not like a fun time. And
My
then
God, we're American. It's not a fun time. I'll kill you. Why? Because I'm not having a fun time, damn it. Jesus Christ. You've been studying economics too long, man. Okay, but okay, all right.
I think that would provide me disutility in my life if I was relocated.
Let's back up a little bit on this and get a walkthrough. The resistance from the Kikuyu is violent. It is acts of terror. They are trying to terrify the white settlers into leaving those territories and going the fuck away. Okay, get out of here. We don't want you here. We will butcher you. So when you have a situation, this happened in South Africa too. It happened in Rhodesia. All right. In every one of those cases, all right, they were very quickly branded by the colonial administration and the imperial metropole as terrorists, just like we do today. This is an externally motivated terrorist kind of thing. Maybe they're communists, maybe they're whatever. Some of it was that Cold War modality of, well, they're radicals of any kind, because they made it clear, we will kill you. We will kill your families because you're killing us. Remember that the Kikuyu and the Highlands, as an example, are very strongly tied to that land over generations. These white settlers are coming in at the barrel of a colonial gun. They're taking all that over. It's not just that they're making profit off of it. They're controlling land to which people believe they have no right. Okay, and Kikuyu were willing to fight for that and willing to die for that. Okay, the response of the British was predictably heavy-handed. No more conciliation. Why? Because you don't make deals with terrorists. See, this is the thing to keep in mind with some of your case studies. As soon as the colonial insurgency crosses that line into the use of the tactics of terror, never mind whether or not they should, or whether, I'm not trying to, morally judge it in any way. Okay, but when you cross that line, all of a sudden, you lose a lot of your support for that image of that, unless you can say, now we have a mission. We're not butchering men, women, and children, right? We're fighting off a vicious attack by brutal, bloodless, soulless terrorists. And in Britain in particular, this was portrayed in the media as these primordial savages, you know, feasting on the civilized white people. There was a tremendous amount of propaganda of the British people and of the British and within the British military to justify, you know what, if they're that bad, we got to go in and kick some ass. You know, the American military kind of tried to do the same thing with draftees in Vietnam. That was one of the challenges of fighting Vietnam with a draftee army, was you got a lot of reluctant warriors in there. And you know, what was it? I mean, the regular boot, I think, was 6 weeks. I think they were even cutting that short. Am I wrong on that, Brett? I know they were just like 1 month wonders.
Yeah, for World War II and Vietnam, they did. It was just crank them through as fast as, you know, it ended up just being shoot. Can you point the gun that way?
Yeah, pretty much. And so the idea is we got to mobilize you. We got to get you people all moving in the right direction. Kill communists, kill terrorists. That became the order of the day. In addition to that, they used the colonial police, which, by the way, includes other ethnic groups within Kenya who might have grievances with Kikuyu. Okay, so, you know, we're going to engage in these acts of infiltration and espionage and terror and all these other kinds of things, and torture, and, you know, you say, you know, forced relocation, say also concentration camp. Okay, so as Kyle said very professorially, it wasn't a fun time. Okay, what ultimately happens? This doesn't really end, arguably, until 1964. Or it's not resolved until 1964. Kenya is given independence. But it's, I mean, the process is absolutely blood-soaked. Okay. The reason why Kennedy is doing this, and he tries to make it pretty clear, is this is really important as a counterbalance to the typical historical narrative of benevolent decolonization. He's not trying to indict the British. He's not trying to indict the French or the Dutch or anybody else. He's trying to kind of set the historical record straight, which is what I want you to be able to do with your case studies, right? It's not about indicting the colonial administration and talking about how evil the white people were. That doesn't help us. It doesn't teach us anything. But what we're trying to do is, let's get this thing as accurate as we can. Let's give as balanced an appraisal of this experience as we can, so that we understand it, not so much in terms of knowing how to judge it, but in understanding what to learn from it. And that's what Kennedy's trying to do. In other words, neither the British nor the French in particular, we could also talk about the Dutch and Indonesia, just became violent because they're savage, evil descendants of, you know, Germanic butchers or something. That's not accurate. They had established a rule of law, granted on their terms, that could no longer be enforced. So what they felt they were fighting was chaos. Pamela started out with the discussion thinking the real challenge here was, how do we maintain stability and order? Well, you can't maintain stability and order when you have an insurgency that is absolutely committed to either your ouster or your extinction. Okay, and they're engaging in all kinds of asymmetrical warfare, and there are bombings and assassinations and kidnappings and all kinds of things. You know, they don't have the wherewithal to get into a standing shooting war with you, so they have to figure out other ways to do it. This also happened with the insurgencies in Indonesia, okay, and many of those were communist. And even that's not very accurate, though, because they weren't Soviet-style communism. One of the things about communism, it's kind of like capitalism. It sort of has to bend to fit in different kinds of environments. And Indonesia is one of the most fascinating and most disturbing narratives of decolonization, because first of all, you're dealing with an extraordinary population that is incredibly diverse, internally antagonistic, very large, very unruly, and a colonial regime that sort of prided itself on being a case study of how to do it right, but then sort of collapsed. Because itself, it was a collapsing power. You know, the Dutch were just simply not a great world power. One of the things that he ends with in a kind of enigmatic way, it's almost like, oh yeah, and he mentions Portugal. Now, Portugal was arguably the weakest of these colonial powers, and yet it was really the last holdout in terms of its colonial possessions, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. What happened? He has a little trouble explaining that. What was going on in Portugal from the end of the Second World War, or from the Second World War, all the way through to 1975, when it granted independence to the last of its colonies? What kind of a regime was Portugal?
Like a quasi-fascist regime, kind of similar to Francisco. And
It was fascist. There was no quasi about it. Novo Estado was fascist. Salazar was a fascist military dictator, just like Franco. Yeah. Okay. But Kennedy explains that in a peculiar way. He says they kind of withdrew from the world. And it was weird. I mean, a lot of people were looking at Portugal because it was always kind of an Iberian afterthought. You know, you got as far as Spain and then you got tired and you wanted to take a rest. And you forgot that Portugal was there and it was this often brutal fascist state. They had this weird ideology of Novo Estado, the new state, and, you know, a lot of the weird futurism that typically is associated with industrial fascism, very much alive in Portugal. A lot of it was promulgated on this kind of fantasy of what Portugal had once been and may someday soon again be. And their colonies, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, were an indispensable component of that. Remember, they were really the first of the European powers to establish settlements in sub-Saharan Africa. They were also the last to leave. And the argument there is that somehow they sort of flew under the international radar. And in part, the argument, and I'm going to be fair with you, I'm not expecting you to make sense of this. I'm suggesting Kennedy can't quite explain it. But he says it seems to have something to do with their withdrawal from the world. If that makes any sense. Yeah, I'm sorry, AJ, I didn't see you had your hand up.
So far we've normally explained the like pressures of decolonization mostly being caused by global relations, right? Like something disrupts some part of the colonial administration. If Portugal's not interacting with anyone, wouldn't that kind of mean they're immune to that in some sense? Like they're really isolated from any of these pressures?
Yes, it would, because remember, he also points out, and a lot of people forget this, that for the most part, they were neutral during the war. They didn't take a side. And they, in fact, did okay by the war in many cases. And so they saw themselves coming out of the war as okay, now we can get back to business. We've got Angola and Mozambique. We've got these territories. They're ours. And, there are things there. I mean, Angola, you got oil. You got all these things that they need. People forget, like, why did the Dutch hang on to Indonesia? Look at the resources there. Look at the wealth in that. Of course, you'd try to hang on to that. Well, for the reasons I think AJ is suggesting, just that idea that they almost became this invisible empire. It's like nobody was really looking at them. Nobody was paying much attention either to what was going on inside those Portuguese colonies. You don't find a lot of attention being paid by the UN, for example. What about human rights violations and stuff like that? Well, first of all, Portugal didn't feel itself to be bound by any of that kind of stuff because it saw itself as the new state and it was going to do things in this new way. And AJ, I think you're right. I think they felt themselves to be immune from these winds of change, that the British Prime Minister was talking about in South Africa. They didn't think anything needed to change. They were all about keeping things the way they had been, going all the way into the future. Yeah. So if any of you are doing, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, AJ, but just to finish my point, if any of you are doing a Portuguese colony decolonizing, you can't make sense of that without looking at Estado Novo, the whole notion of that long period of time of Portuguese fascism. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, AJ. I apologize.
was just gonna ask how the like the Angolan Civil War and that whole Cuba versus South Africa fight in there would have led into this. Would that be the Imperial War that destabilized the Portuguese Empire? Because that's like that whole timeline kind of confuses me in this sense of like, why would Portugal fall apart?
Well, let me get it a different way. Walk me through. Well, walk me through your analysis of how that would answer that question. How would you answer that question?
So part of the Portuguese like the insurrection of Angola, right, is this communist uprising that gets really violent, specifically fighting almost at this point like a proxy war between you end up with Cuba, Russia versus South Africa and the United States. So was that the Imperial War that destabilizes Portugal and crumbles the whole thing, or because it's an Imperial War started around an independence movement in one of the colonies, so it's not like a classical Imperial War that they would talk about when like what World War I is maybe. So it's like I'm struggling to find what starts the end of the Portuguese Empire other than itself.
Well, what I'm suggesting is that in order to do that, if you're going to look at, say, Mozambique or Angola in particular, you've got to start with the fraying of the fascist regime in Portugal, because decolonization in the Portuguese colonies makes no sense until you look at what was eroding the legitimate authority of that fascist state. I mean, part of it, let's face it, is that the leadership in Portugal, just as it did in Spain with Franco, was getting old, you know. And one of the things you know about fascist dictatorships, boy, those dictators are reluctant to, you know, allow for the changing of horses. They just want to ride it to the bitter end. And so that's part of it. That is part of it. There also was the involvement of mercenary forces in places like Mozambique, some of them fighting on either side of the wars you're talking about. Okay, so it became this kind of staging area for insurgencies or counterinsurgencies or reactionary military operations not controlled by the Portuguese state. That's a problematic history that about which I think not nearly enough has been written. But Mozambique becomes very important for that. And people like Samora Machel, who ultimately became the head of state of Mozambique, you know, they get radicalized in these processes. I mean, the example of Ian Smith in Rhodesia, for example, is one that radicalizes a lot of people in the surrounding colonies. This is particularly the case with Mozambique. Okay, so there is a connection historically between what was going on, particularly with the culmination of Ian Smith, again, a quasi-fascist regime at best, right? And the way that people in Mozambique viewed that, and the way that, you know, like the mercenaries coming in to fight on behalf of Ian Smith to, you know, hunt down terrorists, were using parts of Mozambique as staging areas and things like that. If you look at a map, it starts to make more sense. It's one of those things where the geography can help you understand that. Pamela, do you have your hand up? I can't tell.
Yeah, sorry. Maybe this would be kind of like an oversimplification of it too, or at least part of it. But it almost seems like Kennedy was suggesting too that the area that Portugal was holding in that part of Africa was near like what the British were holding, and those were like those federations that they were trying to hold together. And it seemed like because that area wasn't really like overtly like violently like the British area wasn't like overtly like violently destabilized at that point, that like if that area is kind of good, like could that potentially influence it? And then it seems like Kennedy suggests like, well, once, you know, you have Malawi and these countries finally declaring independence, then that's when the Portuguese colonies start to kind of be like, oh, huh, that's a thing.
Well, you're right. I think that's important. You also have the creation of the Organization of African States and things like that. That is, you have again and again and again, you sort of have in these newly independent African countries kind of trying to carry on that British conciliation strategy of alliances and blocs. And of course, the most far-reaching of those, the most ambitious of those was sort of the African version of the United Nations, which is the Organization of African Unity. And when you have these meetings of the OAU, right, all of a sudden, you know, you have these colonies that are obviously kind of left out of that. They want in. That undermines, you know, the sense of loyalty to the Portuguese colonial administration. You have a lot of the leaders who formed the OAU, right? Nkrumah, Nyerere, all of these kind of people
really become radicalized in terms of wanting to eliminate the last vestiges of European colonialism in the continent. Right? So you now have a more transnationally organized resistance to colonialism against which this little tiny Portuguese empire was really not very well equipped to resist. So if that's what you're talking about, and again, the idea of having the relative stability by, say, 1970 in the former British colonies in East Africa, yeah, that's important. There's another thing that often is talked about that was a concern of communism. When people weren't talking about the domino theory, one of the things they were talking about that has validity is something called demonstration effect. So if you're looking at, say, Angola or Mozambique or some of the other colonies as well, right, there might be this phenomenon of demonstration effect. Because what happens is you see the neighbor decolonizing, or you see the neighbor radicalizing and then beginning to achieve something, it might convince you to do that. This is exactly what happened with Laos with respect to Vietnam. First of all, those borders are permeable, and you can swim across the Mekong River many times of the year, right? And so the big concern, for example, in Thailand, which was never colonized in that sense, was the only barrier between us and this growing communist threat in Laos, and it was, is the river. Okay, so they patrol the river, and the whole thing, they're doing anything they can because they don't want, not only do they not want to be infected with the communist virus, but what they used to do was they would broadcast Thai radio that could be picked up in Laos that was all about capitalism and bikinis and martinis and, you know, all this wonderful stuff that you could get if only you'd throw off the shackles of communism, right? What the game they were both playing was demonstration effect. Let's show you how much better this is than what you've got. That was clearly happening in all of the colonies, but of the last vestiges of that, I think there would be two: the Portuguese colonies, and then of course somewhat later South Africa. You know, a lot of it was just, you know, demonstration. You know, once the Reagan administration's notion of kind of constructive engagement began to break down, that was really the beginning of the end of white dominance in South Africa. That was maintained by the United States and indirectly by Israel. Okay, oddly enough. That's an interesting history in itself. Okay. So yeah, I think that's a complicated way to look at it. It's very subtle, but I think it's a compelling narrative. That would be the kind of thing that, again, if you were looking at one of those territories, that might be an avenue to explore it. Does that help? I see, this is in the first time in a long time where it seems like all of you seem just about to have caught up with the reading. And all of a sudden I'm hearing you use those concepts and you're thinking through these things. And I understand when I ask you a question about the reading, I understand for a lot of you, you had maybe one opportunity to read this stuff. You're going to have to go back and read it again. This is fine. What we're doing today, this is fine. You know, sometimes I throw out a little prompt and eventually somebody latches onto it. This is great. I mean, what I want to have you do is be able to get to the point, you know, before you finish your case studies, where this conceptual literature that you find, you know, linked on the Moodle page and in Kennedy's book is stuff that you can feel much more comfortable applying as analytical equipment when you're analyzing your own case. Okay, so if I feel like if you feel like I'm kind of cracking the whip on getting you to read, it's not just it's important to read, but what I hope you're beginning to discover is that some of these perspectives are pretty useful. You know, the kinds of narratives that you know AJ was putting together, or that Pamela just put together, the geostrategic view that Brett put together. These are lenses through which you can see these things and focus in on things that might provide you with really important explanatory variables, right? And this is what I'm hearing today more than in any other class meeting we've had. You're starting to sound more like a room full of experts, right? And that's good. I don't hear the arrogance, but I hear the thinking and I hear the analysis. And ultimately, that's the aim of the class. You know, even beyond your own case study, could you take any case study once you've been through the process once and say, you know what, yeah, I could totally deconstruct that. If I was in graduate school and they asked me to do that, yeah, I could do that. Could absolutely do that. That would be great. All right. Yeah, in fact, we are where I wanted to be right about now in class. This is good. This is the end of week 6. You know, we've got probably 3 productive weeks left, I would say, before you bump into whatever you have that passes for finals in your other classes or anything else. I would be mindful, as they say, I hate that expression. I would be mindful of that, because the thinking is there, the modeling is going on in your heads. I can hear it, and it's really great. You've got enough time, but only if you don't put this thing off. Okay, does that make sense? In other words, this is not quite the time to relax. It's one of the many reasons why I decided to give you Tuesday off. Other than that, I'm just being honest. I know that all day, starting from Tuesday morning, I'm going to be expected to come up with smart things to say. I got a guy checking in with me a couple times from AP and all that kind of stuff. And no, that's not self-importance. It's just that it's an election year and that's my job and that's what I do. You know, I mean, you can look at it cynically and say, yeah, that's right. I get paid to do it. It's part of my service requirement at SOU. Yes, it is. You know, we're supposed to do community service. That's mine. And I just don't think I'm going to have the energy to talk decolonization with you when I'm trying to make sense of this mess that we're dealing with right now. It's just, you know, it's too much. I mean, these 2 doddering old men who want to control the most powerful country in the world. And I'm thinking, really? How about me? You know, how about a year of Hughes? Just a year. I'll quit in a year. Kamala Harris can take over. I don't care. Just give me a year to straighten these people out. You down? You know, because I am. Anyway, that's where I'm going to be. Which talkback thing are you doing? Is it one of the ones with Jason Katz or ASOSU or something else? The most recent one, Quinn, is it's going to happen on Wednesday. It's one that, Danielle Mancuso is setting up.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because I'm on the judicial branch, and so I'm going to all of those, and I'm on a spreadsheet that Danielle Mancuso made, and I was just wondering which one you were going to be at. Is it one of the ones, is it one of the post-election reflections, or?
Yeah, Wednesday at 5.
Oh yeah, that's that one. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just wondering.
No, that's fine. That's totally fine. I'm going to send out a notice for anybody who might be interested anyway. Could I just talk for just a second about that too? I think whatever shakes out with the election, and we're not going to know probably for sure for quite a while, I think everybody might benefit from a chance to kind of blow it out of your system a little bit. Just, you know, blow your nose politically. That's the way I see this thing as being functional. Is that my biggest concern, though, is that, and we actually talked about this in a surprisingly open way. It was an interesting group of people, with only about 4 or 5 of us. And I think one of the real deficiencies at SOU, and this is more than just my personal opinion, I would argue, is we have kind of, whether we've meant to or not, we have allowed SOU to become a kind of hostile territory for people whose political views don't reflect kind of, you know, Ocasio-Cortez and the squad and that. We really have, in a way that I've never seen in the almost 26 years that I've been here. We've allowed a kind of entrenched, polarized, safe space to displace a lot of people whose politics may not square with that. And a lot of the people who are really feeling, and I hear from a lot of these people, are people who are not just politically conservative necessarily, but also people who are veterans, people who have experience that's not like SOU. Part of it is, I mentioned it today, is there's a growing phenomenon in American politics right now, and it's new. It is very recent and historically unprecedented. It's being called a diploma gap. And I think we're really seeing this played out on universities right now. It really only started to show up with the 2008 election. And that is where, in ways that we've never seen before, having a 4-year or better degree in your possession tends disproportionately to push you toward the Democrats. Historically, that has not been the case. You could always rely on there being a slightly greater likelihood that a college graduate was going to be a Republican rather than a Democrat. That only changed, according to the data I have, with 2008, and it's become increasingly obvious. By contrast, if you look at the core support base of, say, Donald Trump, but also of the Republicans in general, it's white, primarily men, with less than a college education. In fact, indeed, with high school or less.
Okay. And that cohort of people is becoming increasingly squeezed by the changes that are occurring in the United States. And my concern with respect to the university, I'm just airing my view, you feel free to disagree, is that we have not made this a very tolerant place. It doesn't have to be welcoming. We haven't made it a very tolerant place for people who come from those small towns, who come from that, not so much that Republican world, but that kind of traditional and conservative world. They got a right to be at the university just like everybody else. And, you know, saying something like that you feel uncomfortable around fill in the blank has become kind of fighting words at SOU. And it never was before. It never was. And that's one of the biggest concerns I have that I'm hoping we can air out a little bit. But that we not perpetuate this notion of the diploma gap, I think is really important. That a lot of us need to remember what we came from. I didn't come from the elite. A lot of us didn't. And I didn't bring with me these kind of rarefied, pseudo-progressive elite values that often come out as a new kind of totalitarianism in their extreme. I'm concerned about the way the wind's blowing in college campuses, and especially at SOU, because we could be doing so much better, but also because we happen to be located in the Rogue Valley, you know, which means we're inviting in a lot of people who come from Douglas County, or, you know, the more, you know, rural parts of Jackson County, or, you know, the more rural parts of Northern California. And they don't want to come here and get berated simply because they're not marching in lockstep with all the social justice warriors. You know, I mean, I don't mean to sound facetious. It's just that we need to talk about that. You know, a university is supposed to be a tolerant environment. And to be tolerant means you put up with things you don't like. I don't think SOU is doing a very good job of that right now. That is my personal perspective. I'm going to argue that it's more informed than merely an opinion. I don't want to try and foist that on you. But it is one of the things that, given the opportunity, I'd like us to be able to talk about, you know, maybe put this election in that context in terms of how we deal with it at SOU. I'm not trying to change anybody's mind or anything else. It's just that I've become alarmed. Very few things alarm me, okay? This alarms me because of my profound belief in the sort of healing power of higher education to take animals like me and make us into relatively useful human beings, okay? I think we are sacrificing that, and that frightens me. Well, it would frighten me if it didn't piss me off, but it's certainly, I find it alarming, okay? That's me. So again, I always tell you that I will clearly label anything that is my opinion. That is clearly my opinion, but insofar as anybody's interested, I'd love to hear your response to that. Either, again, if you don't want to talk about it in class, that's fine. If you want to do that, it's fine. Otherwise, by email. I also would encourage those of you who might be in that cohort of people I'm concerned about specifically, show up at things like this. Feel free to express yourselves. Sorry, Brett, did you have your hand up? I couldn't tell.
I did. It's just, I had a meeting with President Schott about this actually right at the beginning of the summer, because I shared the exact same concerns with the campus as you do, apparently. I almost didn't come back for this term.
I would hate to see that.
I almost said, forget it, you know, I can go work and do other things. But it was important enough to me to finish my education, to come back. So it's good. And again, and something that I said to President Schott, and she agreed with, is college isn't somewhere where you're necessarily supposed to be comfortable. It's supposed to push you outside of your comfort zone, and you're supposed to learn and engage with ideas and new things. And my concern wasn't that I'm uncomfortable. Afghanistan's not a comfortable place. I'm fairly comfortable with being outside of the norm, but it was the not being engaged with that bothered me. You know, and so I feel like that's exactly what you're talking about. And
it is.
So yeah, but it's just glad to hear people addressing it, and it makes me want to continue being part of the community at SOU. So
that's encouraging. That's really encouraging. Yeah, Quinn?
I just wanted to say, I know that they're having a little bit of trouble with publicity, but I'm on the heads of gov for ASSOU, and they're having a couple of different, one on Monday, one on Tuesday, and one on Wednesday, that are all, the one on Wednesday is the one Bill's going to be at, but then on Monday and Tuesday, they're also going to be hosting like dialogues where there is some stuff on Thursday that's specifically hosted by the resource centers that are like anxiety groups and like, what does this mean for my community? But there's also like the one that I was talking about with the dialogues across differences. And there's been quite a bit of prep going into that for the last couple of weeks because we're trying to organize like and facilitate a Zoom discussion that doesn't feel like sort of what you were just talking about, what you were both just talking about. So like that's the goal of those ones. So not that you have to go to those, but I would love, I can send them over to Bill and he could send them out the dates and
Please
stuff.
do. Yeah,
Don't
please do.
mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, because I think it would be a great thing for anyone who is interested to come to, because we're hoping to have actual discussions instead of just yelling the same things at each other and being like, yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. So just tiny plug for that.
No, that's perfectly good. In fact, I kind of wish I'd known that because I would have had you come in if you had the time and speak to my lower division classes this week. I'm sorry I didn't know that. That's my fault. I should have looked into that. In fact, if you wanted to, if anybody putting that together wanted to come in and have a couple of minutes and on Monday, either my 10:30 class or my 1:30 class, you're more than welcome, because I think it helps a lot when students hear that from other students as well. But I really do hope that that we can, I want to give everybody here a sense of power. I don't want it just to be the ones who feel like they're the insiders. I mean, when I was, let me just be really honest, okay? I didn't go to college right out of high school. I lived in Davis for a while, and I remember twice going out and encountering frat boys, because there was a frat house right around the corner from us, going up there with a couple of my buddies and kicking the shit out, okay? Because we thought that that was the absolute scum of the earth, right? Because they were rich, they were entitled, and they were bigots. They were the worst kind of subhumans, and they could get away with it, okay? But they ran that campus in many ways. So that, again, it was that anytime there's that insular minority of any kind that controls what is supposed to be a public institution, it's pathological. Now, again, the proper response to that was not to go kick the shit out of them, but you know, you let them provoke you, and then you say, bring it out on the sidewalk, and then you get it done. But okay, I was 19, cut me some slack. But that's where I first got the idea with respect to universities. That first of all, I don't want to be there because I don't want to be around these clowns. But also, that's when I started figuring out what a university was, and then talking to people who had a college education and realizing what a university could be. I'm pretty idealistic. It's one of the few things I'm kind of idealistic about, is that, this one of the few things, institutions that we've created in the United States that, God, has disproportionate upside to it. And I'm afraid that we're going to sell that out for the sake of a few people, feeling like they've got some sort of weird political cred of some kind, whether they're far right or fake social justice people or whatever they are. Because there ain't no social justice in shouting people down. That's not justice. That's my biggest concern. I don't care who's doing the shouting. That's not justice. That's bullying. And then if people approach you in that way, there are ways to settle that. They don't fix anything, but they can make it stop. And that's what I'm concerned is going to happen. I think there are a lot of people who are really concerned that there are enough people who are profoundly angry about what's going on right now, but also, as part of that anger, profoundly ignorant about what's really going on, that they're going to take out that frustration and rage violently, depending on how this election shakes out. And, I'm hoping that doesn't happen, but I'm not optimistic. So anyway, I don't mean to end this on a kind of downer, but do you see though why I don't think I would be coherent in a class on Tuesday? I just don't think I'm going to be of much use to you, unless you want to talk to me about the election, because that's what my head's going to be. But again, some of you came in late. Just reminders, if you haven't done, please sign in. But also, no class on Tuesday, but by Thursday, I want you to have emailed me a more coherent document of between, say, a paragraph and a page, in which you tell me, here's where I am so far on my case study. Some of you are already in good shape. Do it anyway. It's a good exercise. Put it down on paper. Remind yourself of where your thinking is right now, because then I can set those aside and it allows me to track your thinking. And just email it to me. Or would it be better if I put a link up where you could just upload it to Moodle? Is that better? Why don't I do that? I'll create a link on Moodle and just upload it to Moodle. Let's do that. That way also I don't run the risk of missing your email or something like that. So by Thursday class time, I should have one from every one of you. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, great. Then I'll go ahead and set that link up as soon as I get out of here. In the meantime, I will not see you till Thursday. So give yourself a good weekend, because you're going to need it for whatever happens next week. And then hopefully by Thursday, we're still speaking to each other. We can talk about case studies a little bit, and maybe some concluding remarks on the literature taken as a whole before I begin to cut you loose. All right. Any other questions, concerns, anything like that? I think this was a productive discussion. Go ahead, Pamela. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine. I was actually just going to see if I could stick around for a few and chat with me after class.
Absolutely. Sure. Yeah. In fact, if we're going to do that, then I'm going to go ahead and stop recording right now.